Apologize! Do you have any idea who she is?" his father shouted, rushing toward them with a look of terror after the millionaire humiliated his own wife at the gala. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Stories. May the Almighty bless every woman with unshakable strength, unbreakable faith and beauty that no storm can dim. You are the crown of creation, the silent warrior who heals with love and leads with grace. May your hearts never bow to pain, your spirit never lose hope, and your worth forever shine beyond measure. The world stands tall because of your courage, your patience, and your endless light. But my precious family, why the silence? One like, one comment, it costs nothing, yet it keeps this family alive. YouTube may try to silence our love, but they can never silence the power of a woman's heart and the unity of our family. This is Mission 1000 Likes, a tribute to every strong woman who keeps faith alive. If your heart is true, like the video, if your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." The chandeliers scattered light like broken promises, across faces worth more than kingdoms, but no amount of crystal could illuminate what lived in Sean Abbott's heart. Taraji Bartlett stood perfectly still in her midnight blue gown, feeling the silk against her skin like armor that had suddenly turned to ash. She watched her husband's mouth move, forming words that would change everything, and understood with terrible clarity that this moment had been building for 7 years. Every dismissive comment, every casual cruelty, every time he had made her feel small while convincing her it was love. My wife spends her days playing with numbers and thinking she understands complicated things, Sean said to the Whitmore family, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. I keep explaining that her brain is better suited for simpler tasks. Pretty things should stay pretty, you know what I mean. She doesn't need to worry about real thinking when she has me to handle everything important. The Whitmore patriarch laughed. That hollow sound wealthy men make when they want to seem engaged without actually caring. His wife's expression shifted into something harder to read, something that looked like recognition mixed with disappointment. Around them, conversations continued, but Taraji could feel attention shifting their direction, people pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. The old money crowd never made scenes, but their silence had teeth that bit deeper than any scream. "Sean." Her voice came out steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere else." He turned to her with that smile she used to think meant affection, but had learned over time meant absolutely nothing. "There's nothing to discuss, sweetheart. Everyone here knows you're gorgeous. Nobody expects you to also be intelligent. That's my job, remember? You just stand there and look beautiful while I handle the complicated stuff." The words landed in the space between them like stones thrown through glass. Taraji felt something inside her chest crack, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of ice breaking after months of pressure. She had built this man from ruins he did not even know existed. She had saved his company from bankruptcy 3 separate times, while he slept peacefully, believing his own mythology. She had ghostwritten every impressive speech he had ever given, corrected every catastrophic strategy before it could destroy him, rebuilt his entire reputation with her own invisible hands. And he stood here in front of the city's elite calling her decorative. "You should be grateful," Sean continued, warming to his performance now, playing to his audience like an actor who had finally found his spotlight. "Not every woman gets to be married to someone like me. You just have to stand there and let me make you look good by association. It's the easiest job in the world." Gerald Abbott's face had gone the color of old newspaper. Sean's father stood 10 feet away, watching his son commit social suicide, while knowing something his son could not possibly know. Gerald had hired the Empress 5 years ago, the phantom consultant, whose name whispered through executive suites like prophecy. He had sat across from her in darkened offices where she dissected his company's failures with surgical precision and rebuilt them with architectural genius. And he had promised to keep her secret when she asked, when she explained that she wanted to be loved as a wife instead of worshipped as an institution. She had wanted to know if she could be enough without the weight of her legend attached. Now Gerald watched his son mock a goddess and felt his throat close with absolute horror. "Apologize!" Gerald's voice shattered the polite murmur like thunder breaking through stained glass. "Do you have any idea who she is?" 300 heads turned as one, a wave of attention that made the air feel thick. Sean laughed, actually laughed, thinking his father was joining the performance, adding to the entertainment. "Dad, relax. She knows I'm just playing around. She's used to it." But Taraji's hand was already moving. The slap echoed through the ballroom with a clarity that made people 3 rooms away stop their conversations. Not because it was particularly violent, but because it was so completely final. The sound of a door slamming shut that would never open again. She had never raised her hand to anyone in her entire life, had prided herself on solving every problem with words and strategy and careful negotiation. But some moments demanded physical punctuation, needed the sharp crack of consequence to cut through years of willful ignorance. "You built your empire on quicksand," she said in a voice so quiet everyone had to lean forward to hear it. Each word dropped like a verdict. "Tomorrow you will learn what happens when the foundation walks away. Tomorrow you will discover exactly who you are without me holding you up." She removed her wedding ring with hands that did not shake, even though everything inside her was trembling. The band was modest, because she had never cared about displays, had chosen simplicity over flash, because she wanted Sean to love her for herself rather than for what she represented. She placed the ring in his palm and closed his fingers around it with a gentleness that felt more threatening than any violence could manage. "I gave you 7 years, she continued, her voice still that terrible quiet that forced everyone to strain forward. 7 years of building you up, making you look brilliant, saving you from every disaster you were too arrogant to see coming. I solved problems before you knew they existed. I wrote strategies you presented as your own. I saved your company from collapse so many times I lost count, and you repay me by calling me stupid in front of strangers." "Taraji, wait," Sean started, but she was already turning away. The crowd parted for her like water around stone. She walked through the ballroom in perfect silence, her spine straight, her head high, her heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of a judge's gavel. She did not cry, did not scream, did not give him the emotional breakdown he had probably been engineering for months to prove she was weak. Behind her she left chaos, whispers rising like smoke, phones appearing in hands, recognition dawning on faces that had seen the Empress once, years ago, at consultations that cost more than most people earned in lifetimes. Gerald Abbott grabbed his son's arm hard enough to leave marks. "You fool, you complete and utter fool. That woman you just humiliated in front of everyone we know. She saved this family. She rebuilt Abbott Industries from dust. She is the Empress." Sean's face went blank with incomprehension. The Empress was legend, phantom, the consultant whose name appeared only in whispers and whose work reshaped entire industries. She could not be his wife. His wife was just Taraji, just the woman who brought him coffee in the morning and smiled through his jokes and never complained about anything important. "That's impossible," Sean said, but his voice had gone hollow. Around them, 3 CEOs were already making calls, recognition spreading like wildfire through the crowd. They had paid fortunes for the Empress's consultation. They had sat across from her in shadowed rooms, where she diagnosed their failures with brutal honesty and fixed them with elegant solutions. And they were seeing her again now, watching her walk out of the Grand View Gala with her power finally visible for anyone with eyes to recognize. In the corner, the Whitmore patriarch turned to his wife and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Whatever it was made her expression harden into the look that preceded the end of dynasties. They would terminate their partnership with Abbott Industries before the sun rose, would distance themselves from the sinking ship with the ruthless efficiency that old money had perfected over generations. Sean stood in the center of the ballroom holding his wife's wedding ring while his father looked at him with something that lived between pity and contempt. The party continued. Around them, with the forced normalcy of people pretending. They had not just witnessed someone's complete destruction, but everyone knew, everyone had seen, and by morning, everyone would understand exactly what Sean Abbott had thrown away in pursuit of a laugh that had not even landed well. Outside, Taraji stood on the steps of the Grand View waiting for her car. The night air felt sharp against her skin, cold and clarifying. She looked up at the building behind her, at the lit windows full of people who would spend the rest of the evening discussing what they had just witnessed. She thought about calling someone, reaching out for comfort or validation, but she did not need either. She needed space to feel what she was feeling, without performing emotion for an audience. She smiled then, just a little, just enough. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tonight, she had simply removed her mask, let them see who she actually was, instead of who she had been pretending to be. Tomorrow, she would show them what happened when you declared war on someone who understood power better than you, understood your own reflection. The car pulled up, black and sleek and entirely hers. She had purchased it with money Sean did not know she had. Earnings from consultations he did not know she conducted. She slid into the back seat with the grace of someone who had never doubted her right to take up space, had only temporarily forgotten it while trying to make herself small enough to fit into someone else's life. As they pulled away from the Grand View, she did not look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing anymore. Her phone buzzed with messages already starting to flood in, recognition spreading through networks faster than she had anticipated. She turned it off completely, dropped it in her purse, and closed her eyes. The city lights streamed past the windows like falling stars, and Taraji felt something she had not felt in 7 years of marriage. She felt completely, entirely, unapologetically free. Chapter 2. The Empire Bleeds. Sean woke to silence that felt like screaming. The bedroom stretched too large without Taraji in it. The empty space beside him, a physical presence that made his chest tight with something he could not name. He reached for his phone on instinct and found 17 missed calls from people whose names made his stomach drop. His executive team, his board members, his father calling again and again with the urgency of someone watching a building burn. The sun had not even risen yet, and his world was already ending. He scrolled through messages with hands that wanted to shake, reading words that did not make sense, even though they were written in plain language. Stock prices falling, investors pulling out, partnerships dissolving overnight, emergency meetings scheduled, crisis management teams assembled, everything happening at once, like a dam breaking after years of invisible cracks, finally spreading too far to hold. "This is not real," he said to the empty room, his voice sounding strange in the silence. "This cannot be real." But his phone kept buzzing with new disasters, each message worse than the last. Companies that had seemed solid yesterday were terminating contracts this morning. People who had praised him last week were releasing statements distancing themselves from his name. The world was rearranging itself around his absence with terrifying speed. He called his CFO and got voicemail. He called his head of operations and got a text back that said simply, "I quit. Check your email." "Good luck." He called 3 board members before one finally answered, and the conversation lasted exactly 40 seconds before the man hung up on him mid-sentence. By the time Sean made it to the office, the sun had come up on a nightmare he could not wake from. His secretary would not meet his eyes. The hallways felt wrong, too quiet, like a building that knew it was dying and was already mourning itself. He pushed into the executive conference room and found his board already assembled without him, which was against every protocol they had ever established. "Gentlemen," he started, trying to project confidence he did not feel. I understand there have been some developments overnight. The chairman cut him off with a raised hand, like a stop sign. We need to talk about damage control. Abbott Industries lost 28% of its value overnight. 3 major partnerships have terminated their contracts. The Whitmore family released a statement calling us professionally unstable. We need answers, Sean. We need to know how to fix this before there is nothing left to save. Sean opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. How could he explain that his wife had apparently been holding his entire company together with invisible thread, and now that she was gone, everything was unraveling like a sweater caught on a nail? How could he admit that the miracle turnaround everyone had credited to his leadership had actually been her design, her strategy, her genius disguised as his competence? This is temporary, he finally managed, the words tasting like ash. Market correction. Bad timing. We have weathered storms before. We can weather this one. But even as he said it, he knew no one in the room believed him. They had all seen the video from the gala. The footage was everywhere now. Millions of views across every platform, everyone watching Sean Abbott get slapped by his wife, and then learning that the woman he had mocked was actually the Empress, the legendary consultant, the phantom genius who had saved dozens of companies from collapse. His wife. The meeting lasted hours and accomplished nothing. Strategies were proposed and discarded. Phone calls were made to investors who would not take them. Backup plans revealed themselves as fantasies built on foundations that no longer existed. By the time they broke for lunch, 3 more board members had submitted their resignations via email, each one citing loss of confidence in leadership. Sean sat alone in his office, staring at spreadsheets that looked like autopsy reports. Every number told the same story, written in different languages. His company was dying, and he had killed it by humiliating the one person who had been keeping it alive through invisible miracles he had mistaken for his own competence. His father arrived without knocking, closing the door behind him with the kind of careful quiet that preceded explosions. Gerald looked older than he had at the gala, like he had aged a decade overnight. His suit was perfectly pressed, but his face carried lines that had not been there before. "I hired her 5 years ago," Gerald said without preamble, without greeting, without any of the social niceties they usually observed. "Abbott Industries was failing. You did not know, because I kept it from you, kept the worst of it hidden so you could sleep at night without panic attacks. But we were 3 months from bankruptcy. 3 months from losing everything our family had built over generations. And then the Empress walked into my office and saved us." Sean could not process the words fast enough. His father was talking, but the meaning kept sliding away from him like water through fingers that could not close properly. "She rebuilt everything," Gerald continued, his voice flat with exhaustion. "The operational structure, the client relationships, the strategic planning, the crisis management protocols, everything you think you built over the past 5 years. That was her. Every impressive decision you announced to the board, her strategy. Every disaster we miraculously avoided, her intervention. She made you look brilliant because she loved you and wanted you to feel successful. And you repaid her by treating her like an accessory. Why did you not tell me?" Sean's voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. "Because she asked me not to." Gerald's composure finally cracked, his voice rising for the first time in Sean's memory. "She wanted you to love her as a wife, not worship her as a consultant. She wanted to know if you could value her without knowing her credentials. She wanted to believe that the man she married could see her brilliance without needing external validation. And you failed that test spectacularly." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire neither of them could put out. Sean thought about all the times Taraji had offered suggestions he had dismissed without consideration. All the times she had asked about his work, and he had told her not to worry her pretty head about complicated matters. All the times she had smiled through his condescension while secretly holding up the entire structure of his professional life with invisible hands. "I did not know," he said weakly, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. You should have. Gerald shot back with a harshness Sean had never heard from his father before. Any man who actually paid attention to his wife would have noticed how brilliant she was. But you were too busy looking at your own reflection to see what was standing right beside you. You were too invested in your own mythology to recognize that you were living in someone else's grace. After his father left, slamming the door hard enough to make the windows rattle, Sean sat in the gathering darkness of his office and tried to remember when things had gone wrong. But he could not find a single moment, because it had not been a moment at all. It had been 7 years of small dismissals, casual cruelty dressed up as jokes, systematic erosion of respect disguised as marriage, death by 1,000 cuts so small he had never noticed he was holding the knife. He drove home through streets that felt unfamiliar, even though he had driven them thousands of times. The mansion loomed ahead like a monument to his own stupidity, every window dark because he had forgotten to leave lights on, and Taraji was not there to think of details he always overlooked. Inside, the silence was absolute and suffocating. Her things were gone, removed with an efficiency that suggested she had been planning this for longer than he wanted to think about. Not thrown away dramatically or destroyed in anger, but simply absent, like she had never existed there at all. The only thing she left was a folder on his desk in the home office. Inside were documents spanning years of his company's history, every crisis, every close call, every miraculous save that had made him look like a genius to his board and his competitors. And in her handwriting beside each entry, notes explaining exactly what she had done to fix problems he had never even known existed, strategies she had designed, relationships she had cultivated, disasters she had prevented before they could manifest. At the bottom of the last page, in her distinctive handwriting, "You were never the architect. You were always the facade." Sean read those words over and over until they stopped making sense individually and started meaning everything collectively. He thought about calling her, begging her to come back, promising to be different, swearing he understood now. But even in his desperation, he understood that some doors close permanently. Some bridges burn so completely that even the ashes blow away in wind that carries no mercy. His phone buzzed with another message. The stock had dropped again, down another 12% in after-hours trading. More investors fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. More partnerships dissolving like sugar in rain. His empire crumbling in real time, while he sat in his empty house reading his wife's annotations on his own ignorance. Each note a small violence he had earned through years of refusing to see what was right in front of him. Tomorrow would be worse, and the day after that worse still. And the day after that even more devastating, because Taraji was not just leaving him. She was withdrawing the invisible support she had provided for 7 years, letting him fall without catching him, letting him discover exactly what he was, without her genius propping him up like scaffolding around a building with no foundation. And what he was turning out to be was nothing much at all. Just a man with confidence but no competence, charm but no substance, performance but no depth, a facade with nothing behind it except borrowed brilliance he had mistaken for his own. Chapter 3. The Ghost in the Machine. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building that touched the sky like an accusation against everyone below. Taraji stood at floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city spread beneath her like conquered territory, and unexplored frontier combined, both threat and promise, depending on how you chose to look at it. She had purchased this space with money she had earned entirely on her own, consulting fees accumulated over years of saving companies from themselves while using anonymous channels that protected her identity. Money Sean had never known about because she had kept her financial life completely separate from their marriage in ways she was only now beginning to understand had been preparation for exactly this moment. Her phone rang constantly with calls from numbers she recognized and numbers she did not. Messages from companies who had paid fortunes for her consultation over the years, all of them suddenly desperate to reconnect now that her identity was public knowledge. The Empress was no longer a phantom, no longer a whisper in boardrooms, no longer a legend without a face. She was Taraji Bartlett, and her name was about to mean more than any anonymous reputation could ever achieve. She answered one call from the Whitmore family, the same people who had witnessed Sean's public humiliation of her just hours ago. The patriarch's voice was careful, respectful in a way he had never been when she was just Sean Abbott's decorative wife, who smiled politely. Through dinner parties, without offering opinions on matters that actually mattered. "We would like to discuss a partnership," he said, each word measured like he was negotiating for his life. "Your expertise combined with our resources could reshape everything we have been trying to accomplish. We have been moving in the wrong direction for years, and we know it." "Send me your proposal," Taraji replied, her voice cool and professional. "Include detailed projections about where you actually are versus where you have been claiming to be. Be honest about your vulnerabilities. I do not work with people who lie to themselves. And I definitely do not work with people who lie to me. The Whitmore deal would be worth more than most people earned in lifetimes. But more than the money, it was vindication. These were the people Sean had been so desperate to impress at the gala. The old money crowd he thought would validate his importance and confirm his status among the elite. And they were calling her, not him. Choosing her consultation over their partnership with Abbott Industries. Choosing substance over performance. Choosing the actual architect over the decorative facade. She hung up and looked at her calendar on the tablet beside her coffee. Meetings scheduled solid through next month. Companies lining up for her attention like supplicants before a queen. Offers pouring in faster than she could review them, each one more generous than the last. The Empress had stepped into daylight, and the world was adjusting to her presence, like eyes adjusting to sudden brightness after years of careful darkness. But the sweetest part was not the success or the money or even the vindication. It was the complete absence of Sean Abbott from her thoughts, except as a data point in her own history, a chapter that had ended cleanly without lingering attachment. She had spent 7 years making room for him in her head, calculating how her actions might affect his feelings, moderating her brilliance to protect his fragile ego from confronting its own limitations. Now there was space in her mind for her own dreams again, and the relief of that emptiness felt like breathing after years of holding your breath underwater. Her best friend Imani arrived at noon with lunch from the place they used to meet at before Taraji got married, and stopped having time for friendships that did not revolve around being Sean's wife. They sat at the dining table with the city spread beneath them, and Imani studied Taraji's face like she was reading a map to somewhere she had never been allowed to visit. "You look different," Imani said, tilting her head in that way she had when she was trying to understand something complicated. "Not just free, dangerous." "Maybe I was always dangerous," Taraji suggested, taking a bite of food that actually had flavor now that she was not eating it through the filter of constant anxiety. "Maybe I just spent 7 years pretending I was not." They ate lunch overlooking the city, while Imani filled her in on the gossip spreading through their social circles like wildfire through dry brush. The gala video had gone viral beyond anything either of them had anticipated, spawning countless articles about women's invisible contributions, about the cost of hiding brilliance to protect male egos, about marriages built on unequal foundations where one person does all the actual work while the other takes all the actual credit. Taraji had become a symbol without meaning to, her story resonating with women who recognized themselves in her years of strategic diminishment. "Sean called me yesterday," Imani admitted, setting down her fork with the careful precision of someone delivering bad news. "Begging me to talk to you, begging me to convince you to give him another chance." He sounded completely destroyed, like genuinely broken in ways I have never heard him be vulnerable before. "Good," Taraji said simply without heat or satisfaction, just stating a fact. He sounded like he finally understands what he lost. Also good, Taraji replied, meeting her friend's eyes with absolute clarity. Understanding what you destroyed is the first step toward not destroying the next thing. Maybe he will treat his next wife like a human being instead of an accessory. Imani studied her friend's face for signs of lingering attachment, for cracks in the armor, for any indication that Taraji might still be vulnerable to Sean's eventual manipulation disguised as growth. She found nothing but clear-eyed certainty, the kind of resolution that comes from decisions made from the core rather than from desperation. "You really do not care anymore, do you?" Imani asked, something like wonder in her voice. "I care that he learns something from this," Taraji said carefully, choosing her words with the precision she brought to everything she did. "I care that other men see what happens when you treat your partner like decoration. I care that this becomes a cautionary tale that maybe prevents someone else from making the same mistakes. But do I care about Sean specifically? About his pain or his regret or his journey toward becoming a better person?" She paused, considering the question with genuine honesty. "No, I really do not. Not anymore." The honesty of it surprised them both. Taraji had loved Sean once, or thought she had, or convinced herself she had, because what else do you call the feeling of investing everything you have into another person's success? But looking back now with clear eyes, she could not separate her feelings for him from her investment in the person she had been trying to help him become. She had loved his potential, his possibility, the man she believed he could grow into if she just supported him enough, if she just stayed patient enough, if she just made herself small enough that his growth had room to happen. She had never actually loved who he was, because who he was turned out to be someone who would mock her in front of strangers for applause that did not even sound sincere. That afternoon, a profile piece appeared in the city's most prestigious publication, the kind of magazine that appeared in lobbies and waiting rooms and coffee tables in homes that cost more than reasonable. The journalist had done her homework thoroughly, tracing the Empress's career through anonymous consultations that had saved dozens of companies over the past decade. The article included interviews with executives who praised her genius in terms that bordered on worship, describing her ability to diagnose structural problems within minutes and design solutions that seemed obvious only after she explained them. And it included one devastating paragraph about anonymity, about a woman who had maintained her secret identity not out of fear, but out of desire to be loved for herself rather than her gifts. She had wanted to know if she could be enough as just Taraji, without the weight of the Empress attached to her name like a title that overshadowed the person underneath. She had wanted to believe that her husband could love her for the woman who brought him coffee in the morning, not just for the genius who saved his company from destruction. The interview never mentioned Sean by name. It did not have to. The entire city knew exactly what marriage she was referencing, exactly what love she had been testing, exactly what answer she had received at the Grandview Gala in front of 300 witnesses and countless cameras. Taraji read the article twice on her tablet while watching the sun set over buildings she could now afford to buy if she wanted to. The profile made her sound almost mythical, which was not entirely wrong, but also not entirely right. She was just a woman who understood systems and power and leverage better than most people understood their own motivations. The mythology came from people who needed to believe brilliance was rare, instead of recognizing that it was systematically suppressed in anyone who did not fit narrow definitions of who deserved to be extraordinary. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Abbott, Sean's mother, asking if they could meet, saying she had things to apologize for that could not be handled over text or phone calls, things that required looking each other in the eye while delivering hard truths. Taraji almost ignored it, almost deleted the message and blocked the number because she was done with the entire Abbott family and everything they represented. But something made her pause, made her respond instead of deleting. They arranged to meet the following day, neutral ground. No expectations on either side, except honesty for once. That night, Taraji dreamed about her grandmother for the first time in years. The woman had died when Taraji was young, but her mother's stories had kept her alive in memory, had built her into a legend of quiet brilliance that never got its proper recognition. A sharecropper's daughter who had taught herself to read despite every obstacle placed in her path by people who benefited from her ignorance, who had understood numbers with an intuition that seemed like magic, who had died young from preventable illness and lack of access to medicine that was readily available to people who looked different than she did. In the dream, her grandmother was sitting across from her in the penthouse, looking out at the city lights with an expression of profound satisfaction that made Taraji's chest ache with something she could not name. "You did it, baby," she said in the dream, her voice exactly how Taraji remembered it from childhood. "You became visible. You refused to stay small. You honored every woman who came before you by refusing to disappear the way we had to disappear." Taraji woke with tears on her face and a clarity in her chest that felt like armor settling into place, like purpose crystallizing into something solid enough to build on. She was not just rebuilding her own life in isolation. She was honoring every woman in her lineage who had been forced to stay small. Every brilliant mind that had been buried under the weight of someone else's comfort. Every voice that had been silenced by systems designed to benefit from their quiet compliance. The demolition of Sean Abbott's empire was just the beginning of her work, the dramatic opening act. The reconstruction of her own life on honest foundations was the real work, the slower and harder work, the work that would last beyond headlines and viral videos. And she was finally ready to build something that would outlast her own lifetime. Chapter 4. The Father's Reckoning. Gerald Abbott's hands shook as he poured whiskey at an hour when most people were still sleeping, when the city was quiet enough that he could hear his own breathing like an accusation. The bottle was older than his son, worth more than reasonable, but its value meant nothing compared to the weight pressing on his chest like stones stacked one at a time over decades. He had built Abbott Industries through decades of careful strategy and ruthless focus, had survived recessions and market crashes and technological revolutions that destroyed competitors. But he had never felt as helpless as he did watching his son destroy himself in slow motion while refusing every hand extended to pull him back from the edge. The board meeting was scheduled for mid-morning, but Gerald arrived at dawn, unable to sleep, unable to stop replaying the gala in his mind, like footage stuck on loop. He kept seeing Taraji's face in the moment before she slapped Sean, that expression of complete finality that meant the door was closing and would never open again, no matter how much anyone begged or pleaded or promised to change. He had screamed for Sean to apologize, had tried to stop the disaster in real time with his voice raised in public for the first time in 40 years. But his intervention had come too late to matter, had been too little to change trajectories that were already set. Now he sat in the conference room watching directors file in with expressions that ranged from angry to resigned to exhausted beyond what any single meeting should cause. These were men he had known for decades, had built relationships with through countless negotiations and careful alliances and strategic compromises. But their loyalty was to the company, not to Gerald's son, and they were preparing to do what needed to be done, even if it meant destroying what remained of the Abbott family legacy. Sean arrived last, looking like he had not slept in days, like he had forgotten that grooming and presentation mattered in professional settings. His suit was perfectly pressed, but his eyes were hollow, his face carrying the weight of comprehension that was arriving too late to save anything worth saving. He took his seat at the head of the table with the demeanor of a man sitting at his own execution, knowing the verdict before any words were spoken. The chairman did not waste time on pleasantries or gentle approaches. We need to discuss restructuring immediately. The company has lost 43% of its value in 3 days. Major clients are terminating contracts faster than we can process the paperwork. Investors are fleeing with the kind of panic that suggests they know something we have not acknowledged yet. We need new leadership that can restore confidence, and we need it before there is nothing left to lead. "I can fix this," Sean said, but his voice carried no conviction, just the hollow sound of someone saying words because silence felt worse. "How?" The chairman's tone was not unkind, just exhausted beyond patience. "Every strategy you have proposed relies on relationships we no longer have access to. The partnerships you thought were solid were only solid because your wife maintained them through personal credibility you were borrowing without knowing it. Without her, we are discovering that Abbott Industries was functioning on borrowed time and borrowed genius." Gerald watched his son's face as comprehension continued its brutal work, as realization spread like poison through someone who had spent years protected from reality by invisible architecture he had mistaken for his own competence. Sean had thought he was the visionary, the leader, the reason for their success. He was learning in real time that he had been a figurehead, while Taraji held the actual structure together with cables no one could see until they were cut. "We need to bring in outside consultation," another director suggested carefully. "Someone who can assess our actual situation without ego clouding their judgment or personal attachment, limiting their honesty." "We could ask the Empress," someone said. And the room went very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone has said something everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. Gerald actually laughed, a sound with no humor in it, just exhaustion given voice. "She has already declined. The board sent her an offer yesterday. She rejected it publicly and CC'd the rejection to 5 financial journalists. She is not interested in saving us from ourselves, and she made sure everyone knows it." "Then what do we do?" The question hung in the air without answer, without even the shape of an answer. Just empty space where solutions should exist. They talked for hours and accomplished nothing except documenting their own failure with increasing precision. Every solution required resources they no longer had, relationships that had dissolved overnight, credibility that was hemorrhaging by the hour, like blood from wounds they could not find to bandage. By the time the meeting ended, 3 directors were looking at each other with the expression of people watching something die. Despite their best efforts, despite their expertise, despite everything they thought they knew about survival. Gerald pulled Sean into his private office after everyone else had left, after the building had gone quiet, except for cleaning staff who moved through hallways like ghosts. He poured them both whiskey even though the sun was barely past noon, closed the door with careful precision, and said the things he should have said years ago when saying them might have mattered. "I failed you," Gerald began, his voice rough with emotions he usually kept buried. "Not recently. From the beginning, from before you were old enough to understand what I was teaching you. I taught you that success meant looking successful. I taught you that confidence could substitute for competence if you performed it well enough. I taught you that appearance mattered more than substance because appearance was easier to control. And those lessons turned you into the kind of man who would humiliate his own wife for social approval from people who will forget your name before the weekends." Sean opened his mouth, but Gerald held up his hand with the kind of authority that came from decades of commanding rooms full of powerful men. "No, you need to hear this without interrupting, without defending yourself, without explaining away what cannot be explained away. When I hired the Empress 5 years ago, we were dying. You did not know, because I protected you from that knowledge, like you were still a child who needed shielding from difficult truths. I wanted you to feel successful wanted you to build confidence, wanted you to believe you were capable of running this company your grandfather started and your father built into something that mattered. So I hid our failures and let her fix them in secret. I let you take credit for her work because I thought it would make you into a leader. Dad, Sean tried again. But it did not make you a leader, Gerald continued, his voice getting harder. It made you arrogant. It made you think you were brilliant when you were actually coasting on someone else's genius, like a child riding in a car and thinking they are driving because they are holding a toy steering wheel. And when you discovered that your wife was extraordinary, when you felt threatened by her competence, you could not handle the challenge to your ego. So you diminished her, made her small, turned her brilliance into a joke because acknowledging it would have meant admitting you were never as smart as you pretended to be. The words hung between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning for years, invisible until someone finally pointed out the smell. Sean's hands were shaking around his whiskey glass, his face the color of old paper that had been left in sunlight too long. I thought I was helping you, Gerald continued, something breaking in his voice. I thought protecting your pride was the same as supporting your growth. I thought if I could just shield you from failure long enough, you would eventually become the person you were pretending to be. But I was wrong about everything. The kindest thing I could have done was let you fail earlier when the stakes were lower, when the lessons might have sunk in before you built your entire identity on a foundation that did not actually exist. What do I do now? Sean's voice came out barely above a whisper, the question of a lost child rather than a failed executive. Gerald looked at his son and saw all the ways he had failed as a father, all the moments he had chosen comfort over honesty, all the times he had enabled behavior he should have confronted with the kind of brutal honesty that damages relationships but builds character. And he gave Sean the truth, even though it offered no comfort at all, no path forward, no easy solution to problems that had been building for decades. You accept that you destroyed something irreplaceable. You stop trying to fix it and start trying to understand why you felt the need to destroy it in the first place. You do the hard work of becoming someone worth knowing instead of someone who just looks successful from the outside. You figure out who Sean Abbott actually is underneath all the performance and borrowed confidence, and then you decide if that person is someone you want to be. Will that bring her back? The question sounded desperate, pathetic even to Sean's own ears. No, Gerald said flatly, without mercy or softening. Taraji is done with you. She is done with this family. She is done making herself small to make us comfortable. And she should be. We do not deserve her patience anymore. We never deserved it in the first place. Sean left his father's office looking like a man who had finally understood the weight of his own actions and found it crushing, found it more than he could carry without collapsing under the pressure. Gerald watched him go and felt the full measure of his own failure settle into his bones like cold, settling into a house that has lost its heat. His wife Patricia called as he was sitting in the darkening office, her voice tight with emotions she was trying to control, but not quite managing to hide. I am leaving you, she said without preamble, without explanation, without any of the careful diplomacy she usually employed. Not because of what Sean did, because of what I allowed to happen by staying silent for 35 years while this family turned into something I do not recognize anymore. Gerald absorbed this without surprise, because surprise required not seeing something coming. Where will you go? I have already moved into a penthouse in the financial district, 3 floors below Taraji, actually. I plan to spend whatever years I have left becoming the person I should have been, instead of the person I settled for being. They talked for a few more minutes, making arrangements with the careful courtesy of people who had shared decades but never actually known each other in any meaningful way. After hanging up, Gerald sat alone in his office and felt the full weight of consequences he had spent years avoiding through careful maneuvering and strategic blindness. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues offering sympathy and distance in equal measure, the kind of professional condolences that mean nothing except, "I knew you when you were powerful, and now I am pretending I still do." The Abbott name was becoming synonymous with failure, with arrogance, with the kind of spectacular collapse that business schools would study for decades as an example of what not to do. And Gerald understood with perfect clarity that he had built this ending brick by brick, decision by decision, every time he chose comfort over truth, every time he protected his son from consequences that might have taught him something useful, every time he valued appearance over substance because appearance was easier to control. Outside his windows, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Somewhere out there, Taraji was building an empire on honest foundations. Somewhere, his wife was reclaiming a life she had abandoned decades ago to support his ambitions. Somewhere, his son was finally facing the cost of his own cruelty, without anyone to shield him from impact. And Gerald sat in the ruins of everything he had built, understanding that some endings were earned through years of small cowardices that added up to one catastrophic failure that looked sudden only to people who had not been paying attention. Chapter 5. The Alliance Fractures. Patricia Abbott had not cried in front of another person in 30 years, had prided herself on maintaining elegant composure through every crisis their family had survived or created. But sitting across from Taraji in the penthouse with wine she could not taste and words she could barely speak without her voice breaking, Patricia felt tears tracking down her face like admissions of guilt she could no longer avoid or explain away. "I saw you hiding yourself," Patricia said, her voice shaking despite her attempts at control. "Every family dinner where Sean talked over you like you had not spoken at all. Every party where he introduced you as his wife, but never mentioned what you actually did with your time and your mind. Every moment where your brilliance showed through the careful mask you wore, and he found a way to diminish it before anyone could notice. I saw all of it and said nothing. I watched my son systematically erase you, and I stayed silent." Taraji listened without expression, her face calm in a way that felt more dangerous than anger, more threatening than raised voices or accusations. She had agreed to this meeting, but offered no comfort, no easy forgiveness, no gentle reassurance that Patricia's silence had been understandable or forgivable or anything except exactly what it was. "I told myself it was not my place," Patricia continued, the words tumbling out faster now like a dam breaking. "That marriage was private territory where mothers should not interfere. That you were strong enough to handle Sean's ego without my interference. But the truth is I said nothing, because confronting my son would have meant confronting my own choices. Admitting that I let him treat you the way I let Gerald treat me for 35 years. Admitting that I raised him to think women were supporting characters rather than whole people." She described her own abandoned career, the law degree collecting dust in a box, somewhere in storage, because she had not looked at it in decades. The brilliant young woman she had been before marriage taught her that being extraordinary was less valuable than being acceptable, that competence was less attractive than compliance, that ambition in women was called aggression, while ambition in men was called leadership. She talked about watching her own mother suffocate slowly under the weight of unexpressed genius, dying young with journals full of mathematical proofs no one ever read, because who cares what a woman thinks about numbers? She described 3 generations of brilliant women making themselves small for men who never appreciated the sacrifice, never understood the cost, never recognized that they were living in houses built on foundations of female genius they mistook for natural landscape. "You are the first woman in our family who refused to keep disappearing," Patricia said, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand, like a child who had not learned proper composure yet. "And I am so deeply ashamed that I did not help you refuse sooner. That I watched you make yourself small and said nothing because your diminishment made me feel less alone in my own." Taraji took a long sip of wine before responding, her words measured with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what needed to be said and what needed to be left unspoken. "Your son did not just dismiss me casually," Taraji began, her voice steady and cold. "He systematically diminished me over 7 years of marriage. Every time I offered professional insight, he called it cute that I was trying to understand complicated things. Every time I succeeded at something difficult, he found a way to make it about his support rather than my competence. Every time I showed who I actually was underneath the mask, he made sure I understood that was not the wife he wanted me to be." Patricia nodded, accepting this catalogue of failures she had witnessed and allowed without intervention. "And you watched it happen," Taraji continued, leaning forward slightly. "You watched your son turn me into decoration when you knew I was architecture. You stayed silent because speaking up would have cost you comfort, would have required you to confront your own choices, would have meant admitting that you had raised a man who thought women were accessories. So do not sit here now and tell me you are proud of me when it is finally safe to say, so." The words landed like blows, but Patricia did not flinch away from them, because flinching away would have been one more act of cowardice in a life built from thousands of small cowardices. This was the accountability she had avoided for decades, and she would not avoid it now, even though it hurt more than she had anticipated. "You are right," Patricia said simply, meeting Taraji's eyes, even though it felt like looking into sunlight. "I do not deserve your forgiveness. I'm not asking for it because I do not think you should give it. I'm asking if there is any way I can support you now that does not require you to make yourself smaller for our comfort ever again." Taraji studied the older woman with eyes that missed nothing, that catalogued every micro-expression and calculated every possible meaning. She saw genuine remorse, but also the limits of that remorse, the ways Patricia was still protecting herself, even in confession, still framing her own comfort as part of the conversation. But she also saw something harder to dismiss completely, the first honest conversation they had managed in 7 years of family dinners and polite lies and carefully maintained pretense that everything was fine. "You can hold your son accountable," Taraji said finally, each word chosen with precision. "Not for me. Not to get me to show mercy or come back or save his company from the consequences of his own actions, but because he needs to understand what he destroyed before he can ever hope to become anything worth being. Stop protecting him from consequences. Stop making excuses for behavior that has no excuse. Let him face reality without your interference cushioning the impact." "I can do that," Patricia agreed without hesitation. "And you can rebuild yourself," Taraji added, her voice softening slightly. "Actually rebuild, not just move to a new penthouse and call it growth. Figure out who Patricia Abbott would have been if she had never learned to make herself acceptable to men who did not deserve her compliance. Become that woman even though it is decades late and will cost you everything comfortable you have spent years building." They talked until the sun set, painting the city in shades of orange and purple that looked like bruises healing. Not quite making peace, but establishing something more useful than peace. An understanding, a recognition that both of them had been damaged by systems they had each helped maintain through their silence, their compliance, their willingness to make themselves small for rewards that turned out to be worth less than advertised. A commitment to breaking those patterns, even though neither of them could undo the harm already done, could not rescue the years already wasted, could not save the women who had come before them and never gotten the chance to become visible. As Patricia prepared to leave, she turned at the door with one last confession that had been building since she arrived. "I envied you," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "From the moment Sean brought you home, I envied how brilliant you were and how comfortable you seemed being brilliant without apology. I thought maybe you would change him, show him how to appreciate competence instead of fearing it. But instead, I watched him try to change you, watched him systematically strip away everything that made you extraordinary. And I said nothing because seeing you diminished made me feel less alone in my own diminishment, made my own failures feel less like failures. Taraji absorbed this brutal honesty and offered her own in return. The kind of truth that only becomes possible after everything else has burned away. I looked at you and saw a warning. A brilliant woman who had abandoned herself for family peace. I promised myself I would never become you. And then I spent 7 years slowly making exactly the same choices you made, convincing myself it was different because I was choosing to hide rather than being forced to hide. But choice under pressure is not really choice at all. The recognition settled between them like a shared wound. Two women who had made different versions of the same mistake and were now trying to figure out how to unmake it, how to rebuild from foundations that had proven rotten straight through. After Patricia left, Taraji stood at her windows, watching the city lights emerge as darkness fell like a curtain revealing a stage. Her phone buzzed with another message from a company begging for consultation, another offer. Another opportunity to be openly brilliant instead of strategically invisible. Another chance to build something real instead of hiding behind someone else's success. She thought about all the Patricia Abbotts in the world, all the women who had given up their own identities to support someone else's dreams. All the mothers-in-law who had watched younger women repeat their mistakes and said nothing because acknowledging it would mean facing their own failures. All the generations of brilliance buried under the weight of making other people comfortable with female submission disguised as partnership. Some of them would never reclaim themselves, would die having never expressed their full potential, would be remembered as supportive wives and devoted mothers instead of the geniuses they actually were underneath all the performance. But some of them would wake up, would reach a breaking point where the cost of staying small finally exceeded the cost of becoming visible, would decide that comfort was less important than authenticity, even when authenticity came with costs that seemed unbearable. Patricia Abbott was trying to wake up at an age when most people had settled into their final selves and started counting down years instead of building towards something new. It might be too late for complete transformation. The patterns might be too deeply carved to fully erase. But maybe trying mattered more than succeeding. Maybe the attempt itself was worth something, even if it could not undo decades of strategic smallness and careful compliance. Taraji turned away from the windows and opened her laptop, the screen glowing in the darkness like a portal to futures she was building with her own hands. She had work to do, empires to construct, women to employ who deserved better than what the previous generation had accepted as inevitable. She had spent enough time thinking about the Abbott family and their failures. They were behind her now, all of them. Even Patricia, with her late-arriving remorse and genuine attempts at accountability that could never fully compensate for years of complicit silence. Taraji had forgiven nothing, but she had released everything, had let go of expectations that anyone from that family would ever fully understand what they had taken from her. Let them work out their own salvation without her attention or her energy or her continued investment in their growth. She had her own life to build on honest foundations that would never require her to pretend she was less than she actually was. Chapter 6, The Breaking Point. Sean Abbott discovered that rock bottom had a basement, and the basement had a sub-basement. And beneath that was something darker that had no name at all. The mansion echoed with emptiness that felt like an accusation from every wall, every room, a reminder of the life he had destroyed through casual cruelty he had never bothered to question or examine. He stopped sleeping in the master bedroom after the third night of reaching for Taraji in his sleep and waking to her absence like a knife between his ribs, like a wound that would not stop bleeding no matter how much pressure he applied. Instead, he stayed in his home office, surrounded by spreadsheets that documented his company's slow death and documents that proved he had never built anything real at all, had never been anything except a facade with borrowed confidence. The therapist he started seeing had given him homework that felt like torture, like exposure therapy for the soul. Write down every moment he could remember dismissing Taraji, every joke at her expense, every time he had talked over her, or taken credit for her ideas, or suggested she focus on being decorative instead of substantial. The list had reached 23 pages and was still growing, each entry a small violence he had normalized into marriage, had called love, while systematically destroying the person he claimed to love. "You did not destroy her in one moment at the gala," his therapist explained, with the patience of someone who had walked many men through similar reckonings, who had seen this particular flavor of blindness before. "You destroyed her across thousands of moments over 7 years. The gala was just the first time you did it publicly enough that she could no longer pretend it was acceptable. The first time the mask slipped and everyone could see what your marriage actually was underneath all the performance." Sean wanted to argue, but the 23 pages of his own documented cruelty made argument impossible, made defense seem pathetic, made excuses reveal themselves as the lies they had always been. He had been systematically diminishing an extraordinary woman while convincing himself he was being charming, while thinking his jokes were affectionate rather than corrosive, while treating his marriage like a performance where he was the star, and Taraji was supposed to be grateful for a supporting role in his narrative. His company was dying while he sat in his empty house doing emotional inventory that arrived years too late to matter to anyone but himself. The board had removed him from any decision-making authority, installed interim leadership that was trying desperately to stop the hemorrhaging, but discovering that some wounds are too deep to close. 4 more major clients had terminated their contracts that week, each one citing loss of confidence in leadership. The stock was trading for less than breakfast cost at a decent restaurant. Bankruptcy filings were being prepared by lawyers who looked at Sean with expressions that mixed pity and contempt, and something close to fascination at watching someone self-destruct so completely. He tried calling Taraji exactly once during this period, his hands shaking as he dialed her number. The call went straight to a message saying the number had been disconnected. He tried showing up at her building one afternoon, desperate and pathetic. Security stopped him at the entrance with instructions from Ms. Bartlett that he was not welcome, that his presence was considered harassment, that they had been authorized to call police if he did not leave immediately. He tried sending flowers every day for a week. They were donated to hospitals within hours, the cards unread. He tried writing letters that took him hours to compose. They went unanswered because she had blocked his email, had filtered him out of her life with the efficiency of someone removing a stain. The silence from her was more devastating than any anger could have been, because it proved she genuinely did not care what happened to him anymore. He was not her enemy worth fighting. He was not her heartbreak worth mourning. He was simply irrelevant to her life now, and that irrelevance crushed him more thoroughly than any active destruction could manage. His sister Alexis flew in from Paris and found him sitting in his darkened office at 3 in the afternoon, unshaven and staring at nothing, looking like someone who had forgotten what daylight was for. "You look terrible," she said, with the brutal honesty only siblings could deploy without consequence. "I destroyed my entire life for a laugh that did not even land well," Sean replied, his voice flat and dead. "The Whitmore family was not even amused. I humiliated my wife for approval I did not actually receive." Alexis sat across from him in the chair Taraji used to sit in when she came to his office in the early days of their marriage, back when she still believed he might eventually see her as an equal. His sister delivered the truth he needed to hear with the precision of someone who had been planning this conversation for days. She described meeting Taraji in Paris years ago, purely by chance at a gallery opening neither of them had expected to attend. recognizing immediately that his wife was extraordinary, that she carried herself with the kind of quiet power that does not need announcement, promising to keep her secret because she understood why someone would choose invisibility over acclaim, why a brilliant woman might want to know if she could be loved for herself rather than worshipped for her accomplishments. She talked about Taraji's hope that Sean would eventually mature into appreciating what they had together, her willingness to wait for growth that never came, her patient belief that the man she married could become someone worth the investment she was making in him. "She loved you despite your flaws," Alexis said, each word a small violence. "She believed you could become better than you were. She had faith in your potential, even when you gave her no evidence that potential would ever manifest. And you proved her wrong in the most public way possible. You proved that her patience was wasted, her faith was misplaced, her love was unrequited by anything resembling growth or understanding." "How do I fix this?" Sean's voice cracked on the question like thin ice under too much weight. "You do not fix it," Alexis said flatly, without mercy or softening. "You cannot unhumiliate her. You cannot undestroy 7 years of her patient hope. You cannot become someone worth her time retroactively. The past is fixed. What you can do is stop trying to fix things externally and start trying to understand internally why you needed to break them in the first place." She left him with that impossible assignment, flying back to Paris with instructions to call her when he had done actual internal work, instead of just feeling sorry for himself, instead of just performing remorse for an audience of one who was no longer watching. That night, Sean did something so desperate it would define his public downfall more thoroughly than even the Gala slap. He held a press conference outside Taraji's building at dawn, surrounded by cameras and journalists who could not believe their luck at witnessing such spectacular self-immolation. He read from notes his therapist had explicitly told him not to use, had begged him not to turn into public performance. He apologized for his behavior at the Gala, acknowledged Taraji's contributions to his success in terms that sounded hollow, even to his own ears, begged her to speak to him just once so he could properly explain his remorse. The performance was excruciating to watch, so uncomfortable that even hardened journalists felt second-hand embarrassment. His voice cracked 3 times. He lost his place in his notes twice. At one point, he looked directly up at what he thought was her penthouse window and pleaded with her to look down, to see him, to acknowledge his pain. The problem was, Taraji was not home. She was in London negotiating a deal with an international firm. Her absence from the city, a coincidence that made Sean's theatrical begging even more pathetic than it already was, made his desperation perform for an audience of no one who mattered. The video went viral within hours. Millions of people watched Sean Abbott make a spectacle of his own desperation, while his wife was literally on another continent, not thinking about him at all, living her life without his presence, affecting her decisions in any way. The commentary ranged from sympathetic to scathing, but the overall consensus was that Sean still did not understand what he had done wrong, was still treating accountability like another performance where the right words would manufacture the right response. Patricia called after seeing the press conference, her voice tight with disappointment and something close to anger. "Stop performing," she said without greeting or preamble. "Stop trying to win her back like she is a prize you lost. Stop treating this like a problem that can be solved with the right strategy or the right grand gesture. You broke something that cannot be fixed. Accept that reality and move on to becoming someone different." But moving on required accepting permanent loss. And Sean was not ready to do that yet, because accepting it would mean facing who he actually was without the story he had built around himself. He wanted redemption. He wanted forgiveness. He wanted some path back to the life he had destroyed. He wanted everything except what was actually available to him, which was the hard work of becoming someone different, without any guarantee that different would be good enough or would matter to anyone but himself. His therapist met with him after the press conference disaster and delivered an assessment that felt like surgery without anesthesia, like having your chest cracked open so someone could point at your diseased heart and explain exactly how sick you were. "You are still trying to control the narrative," the therapist explained, speaking slowly like Sean was a child who needed simple words. "Still trying to make this about your pain instead of her experience. Still centering yourself in a story where you should be peripheral at best. Until you can sit with the reality that you harmed someone irreparably and there is no path to making it right, you cannot actually grow past this. Until you can accept that some damage is permanent, you will keep trying to perform your way out of consequences." Sean went home to his empty mansion and sat in darkness, understanding that growth required letting go of the person he had thought he was, accepting that the confident, successful, self-made man had been a fiction built on borrowed credibility, acknowledging that underneath that fiction was someone much more fragile and much less competent than he had ever allowed himself to admit. The question was whether he had the courage to do that work without any promise of reward, whether he could become better purely because being who he was had become intolerable, not because being better would win anything back or restore anything lost. He did not know the answer yet, but for the first time in his life, he was actually asking the right question instead of performing someone who already knew all the answers. Chapter 7. The Reconstruction. Taraji stood on stage at a women's leadership conference addressing 5,000 people who saw themselves reflected in her story like mirrors they had been avoiding for years. She wore a deep purple suit that looked like power crystallized into fabric. Her natural hair styled in a way that said she had stopped performing femininity for audiences who did not deserve the show, who had never appreciated the work that went into making diminishment look effortless. The stage lights were hot enough to make her skin prickle, but she stood perfectly still, commanding attention through presence rather than performance, through substance rather than spectacle. "I hid myself for 7 years, she told the crowd, her voice carrying to the back of the auditorium without strain. "I made myself smaller every single day because I thought that was what love required. I thought if I could just be patient enough, if I could just support him long enough, my husband would eventually see me, actually see me for who I was. Not the wife he wanted me to be, not the decorative accessory that made him look successful, but the actual woman I was, underneath all the performance of acceptability." 5,000 women leaned forward as one, hanging on every word like their lives depended on understanding what came next. "But here is what I learned," Taraji continued, her voice getting stronger. "Some people are fundamentally incapable of seeing you because they are too busy looking at their own reflection, too invested in their own mythology to notice that someone else is writing it for them. And no amount of patience will change that. No amount of making yourself smaller will make them bigger. You cannot save someone from their own limitations by disappearing into their shadow and pretending the darkness is warmth." The applause started before she finished the sentence, building into a wave of recognition that lasted long enough to make her eyes sting with tears she refused to let fall in front of an audience. These were her people, women who had hidden themselves to protect male egos, women who had made themselves acceptable instead of extraordinary, women who were finally done apologizing for taking up space that had always belonged to them. She talked for an hour about visibility and its costs, about reclaiming power after years of strategic invisibility, about building something real instead of continuing to be someone's invisible foundation that held up structures they took credit for building. She did not mention Sean by name, but everyone knew exactly what marriage she was referencing, exactly what humiliation had catalyzed her transformation from hidden genius to visible empress. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes, maybe longer, Taraji stood in the thunder of it and felt more aligned with her purpose than she ever had when she was building other people's empires in shadows they did not even know existed. Afterward, dozens of women approached her with stories that echoed her own. Brilliant women hiding their competence to protect relationships that punish them for being extraordinary. Extraordinary women making themselves acceptable because acceptable women received love, while difficult women received loneliness disguised as choice. Powerful women pretending they were not dangerous because dangerous women made everyone uncomfortable. One woman in particular stayed after everyone else had gone, lingering near the stage with the hesitation of someone working up courage. Young, clearly brilliant, clearly exhausted from hiding herself, from performing compliance while her real self suffocated underneath. "I work for a company that would collapse without me," the young woman said, her voice shaking slightly. "But my boss takes credit for everything I do. Everything I create, everything I solve, everything I build gets presented as his work. And I let him because speaking up would make me difficult, would make me unlikable, would cost me the job even though I'm the only reason the job is worth having." Taraji looked at this young woman and saw herself 7 years ago, standing at the same crossroads, making the same calculations about safety versus visibility, about comfort versus authenticity. "What is your name?" Taraji asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Simone." "Simone, I'm going to tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was your age, when I was standing exactly where you are standing now." Taraji took the young woman's hands with a firmness that demanded attention. "You do not need permission to claim your own power. You do not need to wait for someone to see you before you allow yourself to be visible. The cost of hiding is higher than the cost of being seen, even though being seen is terrifying. Even though being seen means some people will hate you for refusing to stay small. Even though visibility comes with consequences that seem unbearable until you realize that invisibility was killing you slower, but just as certainly." "But what if I lose everything?" Simone's voice shook with the question. "Then you will rebuild on honest foundations," Taraji said with absolute certainty. "And what you build will actually be yours, instead of something constructed from borrowed credibility and silent suffering. I lost a marriage. I destroyed my husband's company. I burned down everything comfortable in my life. And I would do it again tomorrow, without hesitation, because hiding myself was killing me slower than fire, but just as certainly." She offered Simone a position on the spot, her first official employee in a consulting firm that would exclusively develop and promote female talent, that would create the structures she wished had existed when she was making herself small. Simone accepted with tears running down her face, and something in Taraji's chest settling into place like bones knitting back together after a break, like wholeness returning after years of fragmentation. This was the real work. The work that would last beyond headlines and viral videos. Not destroying Sean's empire, but building something better on foundations that would never require anyone to pretend they were less than they actually were. Over the following weeks, Taraji hired 8 more women, brilliant, exhausted women who'd been making themselves acceptable for too long, who had been hiding their competence to protect relationships that punished them for being extraordinary. She paid them more than they had ever earned, gave them authority their previous employers had denied them, created space for them to be extraordinary without apology or performance. The consulting firm grew faster than she had projected, faster than seemed reasonable. Companies desperate for her expertise found themselves working with her team instead, and discovered that genius was not as rare as they had believed. It had just been systematically suppressed, hidden, discouraged from full expression because systems benefited from brilliant women staying quiet and compliant. Taraji named the firm Reclamation. Not subtle, but accuracy mattered more than subtlety at this point. They were reclaiming power from systems designed to take it, reclaiming visibility from cultures that demanded invisibility as the price of love, reclaiming space that had always belonged to them, but they had been taught to vacate for someone else's comfort. Her mother called every evening now, their relationship deepening into something more honest than it had ever been when Taraji was performing the role of successful wife. They talked about generations of brilliance buried under expectation, about grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had died with their genius unexpressed, with their potential locked inside bodies that were only valued for their service rather than their minds. They talked about breaking patterns that had persisted across decades, about how Taraji, refusing to disappear, honored every woman in their lineage who had never gotten the chance to be visible, who had died without anyone knowing what they could have become if the world had been different. "Your grandmother would be so proud," her mother said one evening, her voice thick with emotion that decades had not diminished. "I wish she could have seen this," Taraji replied. Looking out at the city she was reshaping in her own image. "Baby, she is seeing it. She is seeing it through you. Every time you refuse to make yourself small, every time you claim space without apology, every time you build something real instead of hiding behind someone else's success, she is seeing it. And she is proud beyond what words can express." Taraji sat in her penthouse after that call, looking out at the city lights that stretched toward infinity, and allowed herself to cry with something that felt like grief and liberation combined, like mourning and celebration happening simultaneously. She was living the life her grandmother could only have dreamed about, and that gift came with the weight of responsibility to use it well, to honor the sacrifice of all the women who came before her. The Whitmore deal closed successfully, adding 7 figures to her already substantial wealth. 3 other major companies had hired Reclamation for consultations that would reshape their entire operational structures, that would require years of work, and would establish her firm as the standard for excellence. She had more work than she could handle, more success than she had space to celebrate, more visibility than she had ever imagined wanting when she was hiding herself to protect someone else's ego. And through it all, Sean Abbott remained completely absent from her thoughts, except as a cautionary tale she sometimes referenced when talking to young women about the cost of hiding themselves, about the price of making yourself small for love that turns out to be conditional on your continued diminishment. She had heard through mutual acquaintances that he was doing therapeutic work, attending support groups for men working through narcissistic patterns, trying to understand his own toxicity. Whether his transformation was genuine or just another performance remained to be seen, remained to be determined by years of sustained behavior rather than weeks of dramatic gestures. But either way, it was not her problem anymore, not her project to manage, not her responsibility to fix. His transformation, if it was real, was something he needed to do for himself and for whatever relationships he might build in the future. But it had nothing to do with her anymore. She had moved on completely, had released any investment in his growth or his redemption or his eventual understanding of what he destroyed. She had her own empire to build, and this one would have honest foundations that never required anyone to pretend they were less than they actually were. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Gerald Abbott's hands looked ancient in the morning light that streamed through his home office windows with the kind of clarity that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. When had they become so spotted with age? When had the veins become so prominent that they looked like maps of rivers carved into landscape? He studied them like they belonged to someone else. These hands that had built an empire and raised a son and failed at both in ways he was only now beginning to comprehend with anything approaching honest assessment. The envelope on his desk contained documents that would transfer ownership of certain Abbott family assets directly to Taraji Bartlett, not as apology, because apologies were just words, and words meant nothing compared to action, compared to actually paying debts that should have been paid years ago. but as acknowledgement of debt owed. Recognition that she had built more of the Abbott empire than anyone named Abbott had in a generation, maybe in the entire history of their family's accumulated wealth. His lawyer had questioned the transfer, suggested alternative structures that would protect family interests and minimize exposure. Gerald had fired him on the spot without explanation and hired someone who would simply process the documents without editorial commentary about what the Abbott family should protect or preserve. These assets were his to give, carved out from family holdings decades ago as insurance against the kind of catastrophe that was now manifesting in real time. He had always planned to leave them to Sean, had imagined his son building on foundations Gerald had laid. But Sean had forfeited any right to inheritance through his spectacular demonstration that he was not worthy of anything he had not earned entirely himself, that he confused performance with substance so completely that he had destroyed his own life for applause. Gerald called Taraji's assistant to request a meeting, expecting refusal, prepared for rejection. She could have said no, would have been justified in never speaking to any Abbott again, in blocking their entire family from her life with the finality of someone removing a cancer. But she granted him 2 hours the following evening, perhaps curious about what the old man had left to say, perhaps willing to hear him out one final time before closing that door permanently. He arrived at her penthouse, carrying the leather portfolio like it was fragile, like it contained something precious that might break if handled roughly. Taraji opened the door herself, no assistant present, making it clear this was personal territory where professional protocols did not apply, where he would get no buffer between himself and her judgment. They sat across from each other, with the city spread beneath them like a map of everything they had each lost and gained through this catastrophe, this spectacular collapse of comfortable fictions they had all been maintaining. "I kept your secret for 5 years, Gerald began, diving straight into confession without social pleasantries. "And I kept it for the wrong reasons. You asked me to stay silent so Sean could love you as a wife, instead of worshipping you as a consultant. I stayed silent because it was easier than admitting. My son was not competent enough to run the company. Without your invisible support propping him up like scaffolding around a building with no actual foundation." Taraji listened without expression, letting him deliver his confession without interference or comfort. "I watched him diminish you at family dinners," Gerald continued, his voice rough with emotions he usually kept buried. "Watched him take credit for your work with the casual entitlement of someone who had never questioned whether he deserved credit. Watched him treat you like decoration when I knew you were architecture, when I had personally witnessed your genius rebuilding my company from ruins. And I said nothing, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting I raised a son who was fundamentally unequipped for the responsibilities I gave him, for the legacy I expected him to carry." He opened the portfolio and spread documents across the table between them with hands that shook slightly. Detailed records of every instance where her consultation had saved Abbott Industries from disaster. Every crisis she had navigated while Sean slept peacefully, believing everything was fine. Every strategic decision she had made that Sean later presented as his own brilliant insight. The catalogue of her invisible contributions was devastating in its completeness, in the sheer weight of genius, disguised as luck or good timing. "This is what you built," Gerald said, gesturing at the documents. "This is your work, your strategy, your genius. And this," he pushed the transfer documents toward her with careful precision, "is what you earned, what should have been paid years ago, with proper recognition instead of secret gratitude." Taraji studied the papers carefully, reading each clause with the attention she brought to every contract. The assets were worth significant money, but more importantly, they were acknowledgement of something that should have been acknowledged years ago, recognition of debt that had accumulated interest in the form of humiliation and erasure. She looked up at Gerald with eyes that missed nothing, that calculated every angle. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady and cold. Why not 5 years ago when you first discovered who I was? Why not 3 years ago when you watched your son systematically disrespect me at every family gathering? Why not 1 year ago before things reached the breaking point? Why now, when it costs you nothing because everything is already destroyed? The question was fair and brutal, and Gerald accepted it without flinching, because flinching would have been one more act of cowardice in a life built from thousands of small cowardices. "Because I am a coward," he said simply, offering no defense or explanation. "Because I prioritized my own comfort over your dignity. Because I thought protecting my son from consequences was the same as helping him grow, when it was actually preventing him from developing any real competence. Because I am an old man who confused enabling with love, and I am out of time to keep making the same mistakes without calling them what they are." "You raised a son who thinks women are accessories," Taraji said, each word precise. "And you are asking me to accept property as compensation for that failure of parenting." "No," Gerald corrected carefully. "I'm not asking you to accept anything as compensation, because there is no compensation for what you endured. I'm trying to pay a debt that should have been paid years ago. What you do with these assets is entirely your choice. Keep them, sell them, burn the documents and tell me to go to hell. But I needed to acknowledge what you built before I am too old or too dead to do so." Taraji considered this for a long time, the silence stretching between them like a test neither of them was sure the other would pass. "I will accept these transfers," she finally said, "but not as compensation for your failures as a father-in-law, as earned payment for services rendered, for work completed, for value delivered that was never properly recognized. And I have one condition that is non-negotiable. Name it. You will make a public statement acknowledging that Abbott Industries' success over the past 5 years was built on consultation from the Empress, that your family's failure to properly credit my work was your greatest mistake as leaders. You will tell the truth even though it destroys what remains of your reputation, even though it makes you look foolish. Even though it costs you everything comfortable you have been protecting." Gerald did not hesitate, did not ask for time to consider, did not try to negotiate softer terms. "I will have the statement drafted and released by tomorrow afternoon." The statement went out the following day through every financial publication in the city, through channels that ensured maximum visibility. Gerald Abbott, acknowledging publicly that his family's success had been built on uncredited consultation from the Empress, revealed now to be Taraji Bartlett, that she had been the invisible architect of everything the Abbott family had achieved in recent memory, that their failure to honor her contributions was a moral failing that had cost them everything that mattered, that had destroyed their legacy more thoroughly than any external force could have managed. The response from the financial community was immediate and overwhelming. Complete vindication for Taraji, total humiliation for Sean, grudging respect for Gerald's willingness to tell the truth when truth-telling offered no benefit except accuracy, when honesty cost him everything he had spent decades building. Patricia called him after reading the statement, her voice carrying emotions she did not bother to hide anymore. "That was honest," Anto, she said, something like surprise in her tone. "That was finally actually honest. It cost you everything comfortable, and you did it anyway." "Too little, too late," Gerald replied, exhaustion making his voice flat. "But at least it was true. At least I stopped lying before I died." They talked for a few more minutes. Two people who had shared decades, but never actually been honest with each other until everything fell apart and forced truth out like poison from a wound. Patricia told him she had moved into her own penthouse, was rebuilding herself at an age when most people had settled into their final form and started preparing for death. Gerald told her he was proud of her, which was possibly the first time he had said those words in their entire marriage. After the call ended, Gerald sat alone in his office, watching the sun set over a city that no longer held space for the Abbott Empire in any meaningful way. His company was being dismantled piece by piece, sold off to competitors who would absorb what was valuable and discard the rest. His son was doing therapeutic work that might or might not result in genuine transformation. His wife was reclaiming herself after decades of strategic invisibility. His family's reputation was demolished beyond reconstruction, reduced to cautionary tale that business schools would study for decades, and Gerald understood with perfect clarity that this ending had been building for generations, that he had inherited patterns from his own father, passed them to his son, created systems that benefited from women's silence while punishing them for speaking, that the gala had not been an isolated incident, but the culmination of decades of choosing comfort over justice, performance over substance, appearance over reality. Some endings were earned through years of small cowardices that added up to catastrophic failure. This was one of them. He poured whiskey he could no longer taste and toasted his own downfall, accepting it as exactly what he deserved for decades of enabling mediocrity while calling it excellence. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. 6 weeks after the Grandview Gala, the city had reorganized itself around Taraji Bartlett's visible presence, the way planets reorganize around new gravity, the way ecosystems adapt to new apex predators who change every relationship by existing. She gave interviews where she spoke plainly about the cost of hiding brilliance, about marriages built on unequal foundations, where one person carries all the weight while the other takes all the credit, about the systematic ways women were taught to make themselves acceptable instead of extraordinary, compliant instead of powerful. Her story resonated far beyond her individual experience, becoming a touchstone for national conversations about invisible labor and suppressed genius and the price women paid for other people's comfort. Think pieces appeared in publications she had never heard of. Her name trended on platforms she did not use. Women she had never met shared their own stories of hiding themselves, of making themselves small, of discovering too late that the cost of invisibility was higher than the cost of being seen. The Empress Network had grown into a genuine movement with chapters forming in cities across the country, with thousands of members committed to refusing collective invisibility. Women executives joining together to amplify each other's work, to document their contributions before anyone could erase them, to create systems that made female genius visible by default rather than exceptional by accident, promising to hold each other accountable, to call out diminishment when they witnessed it, to dismantle structures that forced them to choose between being loved and being visible. Taraji had become something close to legendary without meaning to, her transformation from hidden consultant to visible empress, the kind of story that would be retold for generations as evidence that reclaiming yourself was possible even after years of strategic disappearance. But what surprised her most was how little she thought about the Abbott family anymore, how completely they had faded from her daily consciousness. They had become background noise in her life, people she used to know, cautionary tales she referenced occasionally but did not dwell on with any emotional investment. Sean had disappeared from public view after his press conference. Disaster made him a walking punchline. She heard through mutual acquaintances that he had taken a job at a mid-level firm, accepting work several levels below where he had been just months ago, that he was attending support groups for men working through narcissistic patterns, sitting in circles and admitting out loud the ways he had harmed people who loved him, that he was trying to do actual internal work instead of just performing remorse for audiences who no longer cared what he thought or felt. Whether his transformation was genuine remained to be seen, remained to be tested by years of sustained behavior rather than weeks of dramatic gestures and public apologies. But either way, it was not Taraji's concern anymore, not her project to monitor or evaluate or have opinions about. Patricia had become an unexpected ally in ways neither of them could have predicted 6 weeks ago. The older woman had thrown herself into rebuilding with surprising ferocity, using her abandoned law degree to provide free support for women escaping difficult circumstances, representing them in cases more experienced lawyers avoided because the clients could not pay premium fees. They met for dinner occasionally. Not quite family, but something more complex and more honest than family had ever been when they were pretending everything was fine. "I looked at old photos last night," Patricia told her over wine one evening, her voice carrying weight. "Pictures from my wedding. I was so young, so brilliant, so certain I could have everything if I just learned to be patient and compliant. And I spent the next 3 decades being patient while my own life passed me by, while my own potential died from neglect." "You are reclaiming it now," Taraji said. "Recognition of effort without sugarcoating reality. At an age when most people have already become who they will be until they die," Patricia replied with brutal honesty. "Better late than never, I suppose. But I think about all those years I wasted making myself acceptable, and I want to scream loud enough to shatter windows." "So scream," Taraji suggested simply. "No one is stopping you anymore except yourself." Patricia actually laughed at that, a sound with edges sharp enough to draw blood. "I spent so long being quiet that I'm not sure I remember how to make noise. But I am trying. That has to count for something, even if it cannot undo decades of silence." Alexis had returned from Paris permanently, opening a gallery in the financial district that featured exclusively female artists, using Abbott family money to amplify voices that had been systematically silenced for being too bold or too political or too angry to be commercially viable. The 3 women formed an unlikely alliance, bound not by blood or law, but by shared understanding of what it cost to reclaim yourself after years of diminishment, after decades of making yourself small for rewards that turned out to be worth less than advertised. Taraji's consulting firm Reclamation had grown faster than even aggressive projections suggested, now employing 15 brilliant women who were finally allowed to be openly extraordinary, without apology or performance. They consulted for companies that were serious about change, turning down clients who wanted their credibility without their uncomfortable honesty about structural problems. The firm had a waiting list of potential employees and clients both. Proof that genius was not rare, but had simply been systematically suppressed by cultures that benefited from brilliant women staying quiet. She was building something that would outlast her lifetime, creating structures that would support the next generation of brilliant women so they would not have to choose between visibility and love the way she had been forced to choose. One afternoon, Taraji received a letter that arrived by courier. Sean's handwriting on the envelope. Her first instinct was to throw it away unopened, to refuse him even this small access to her attention. But curiosity made her pause, made her open it, standing by her windows with the city spread beneath her like territory she had conquered through refusing to disappear. The letter was different from every other communication he had sent over the past 6 weeks. No apologies that meant nothing without changed behavior. No begging that revealed he still thought this was about him. Just detailed account of the therapeutic work he was doing, the patterns he was recognizing in his own behavior, the ways he was learning to see women as whole people rather than supporting characters in male narratives. He acknowledged that this work was for himself rather than for her, that he had no expectation of forgiveness or reconciliation or even response. But he wanted her to know that he finally comprehended what he had destroyed, that he understood the magnitude of his failure as a husband and as a human being. Taraji read it twice, trying to determine whether this was sophisticated manipulation or genuine growth, whether Sean had simply learned to perform remorse more convincingly, or whether something fundamental had actually shifted in how he understood himself and his impact on others. Then she decided it did not matter. Whether Sean was actually changing or just performing change better was irrelevant to her life now. had no impact on her daily experience or her future plans. She had rebuilt herself without him, created an empire that answered to no one but herself, found purpose in visibility after years of strategic invisibility. She wrote a single response on heavy cardstock that cost more than seemed reasonable. "I believe you are trying to do the work. I'm glad for you. But my forgiveness is not something you need for your healing, and your growth is not something I need for mine. We are separate now, completely and permanently, and that separation is the healthiest thing either of us has done in years." The response was final, in a way that felt more conclusive than anger could ever be, establishing boundaries that would never shift regardless of how much personal development Sean managed to achieve. She sent the letter and felt nothing except relief that this chapter was finally, completely closed, without possibility of reopening. That evening, she had dinner with Patricia and Alexis at an exclusive restaurant where they celebrated another successful quarter for reclamation, where they toasted to continued growth and sustained excellence. The three women talked about their individual projects with passionate intensity that made other diners glance over, wondering what these extraordinary women could possibly be planning that generated such visible excitement. "I'm grateful for the gala," Patricia said suddenly, making both Taraji and Alexis look at her with surprise. "I know that sounds terrible, but watching what happened to you, watching you rebuild yourself afterward with such fierce determination, it forced me to face my own complicity in systems that harm women, including myself. Without that catalyst, I would probably have lived another 30 years as a decorative figure in someone else's story, dying without ever expressing my full self." Taraji absorbed this perspective, understanding that Patricia was right, even though acknowledging it felt strange. She had lost a marriage and gained herself in the exchange. The trade had been devastating, but ultimately worth making. "Sometimes things need to be destroyed completely before they can be rebuilt properly," Alexis added, raising her glass. The Abbott family was overdue for demolition. Better it happened now than after another generation of women suffered in silence. They toasted to destruction as necessary precursor to genuine reconstruction, to endings that created space for better beginnings. Then they ordered dessert and talked about the future with the kind of unguarded excitement that came from finally being allowed to be their full selves without apology or diminishment. Later that night, alone in her penthouse, Taraji stood at her windows, watching the city lights stretch toward infinity like possibilities she was only beginning to explore. She thought about Sean occasionally now, not with anger or love, but with distant curiosity about people who used to matter in your life, who shaped you in ways you only understood after they were gone. The revenge she had taken was not about destroying him, but about refusing to keep disappearing for someone else's comfort, about choosing visibility even when it came with tremendous costs, about building something real instead of continuing to be someone's invisible foundation. She was free now in ways that went beyond legal or financial independence, free from the prison of other people's limited imagination about who she could be. And that freedom was worth everything it had cost. Chapter 10. The Beginning After the End. 3 months after the Grandview Gala, Taraji received an unexpected visitor at her office. The young woman introduced herself as Jennifer, someone who had heard Taraji speak at the leadership conference and recognized herself in every word about hiding brilliance to protect fragile egos. She was exhausted from years of making her ideas sound like they came from men, from solving problems and letting other people take credit, from being brilliant in private while performing acceptable in public. "I spend my days making myself smaller so my boss can feel bigger," Jennifer said, her voice shaking with suppressed frustration. "I write solutions that get presented under someone else's name. I fix disasters and watch other people get promoted for my work. And I stay silent because speaking up would make me difficult, would make me unlikable, would cost me everything I have been building. Taraji looked at this young woman and saw herself 7 years ago, saw Simone from weeks ago, saw Patricia and her own mother and grandmother and generations of brilliant women who had been taught that their genius was less valuable than their agreeability. She saw the cost of that teaching written across Jennifer's face like scars that would never fully heal. "What are you willing to risk for yourself?" Taraji asked directly. Jennifer looked startled by the question, by the direct challenge instead of sympathetic understanding. "I do not know. Everything I have seems too precious to gamble." "Then you do not understand what you are already losing," Taraji said, with the kind of honesty that felt like violence but was actually mercy. "You are losing yourself day by day, piece by piece, every time you make yourself smaller for someone who does not deserve your compliance. The cost of staying is higher than the cost of leaving, even though leaving feels impossible right now." She offered Jennifer a position as her 16th employee. Another brilliant woman finally allowed to be openly extraordinary. Jennifer accepted with tears that came from somewhere deeper than gratitude, from relief so profound it felt like resurrection. Over the following weeks, reclamation continued expanding beyond what Taraji had imagined possible when she walked out of the Grandview Gala with her power finally visible. Her firm was reshaping how companies understood talent, how they recognized genius, how they created space for brilliance that did not perform acceptable femininity. Her mother called one evening with her voice thick with emotions that decades had not diminished. "Your grandmother came to me in a dream last night. She was young, younger than I ever knew her, and she was smiling in a way I had never seen her smile in life. She told me she was proud beyond words." Taraji sat in her penthouse after that call and allowed herself to cry with something that felt like grief and liberation combined, like mourning everyone who came before her while celebrating her own becoming. She was living the life her grandmother could only have dreamed about, and that gift carried responsibility to use it well. The city spread beneath her like a map of everything she had lost and everything she had gained through refusing to keep disappearing. She thought about Sean occasionally now, distant curiosity about someone who used to matter. She had heard through acquaintances that he was still doing his work, still trying to understand his own toxicity with help from professionals who specialized in helping men recognize their impact. Whether his transformation was genuine was his concern, not hers anymore. 6 months after the gala, Taraji stood on stage at another conference addressing women who saw themselves in her story. But this time, she did not talk about what she had lost. She talked about what she had gained by refusing to keep disappearing, by choosing visibility over comfort, by building something real instead of hiding behind someone else's success. "Visibility costs everything comfortable," she told the crowd of thousands. "But invisibility costs everything that matters, and I would rather lose comfort than lose myself ever again." The standing ovation lasted longer than before, thousands of women recognizing truth that resonated in their bones. Taraji stood in the thunder of it and felt completely aligned with her purpose, with the person she was becoming without apology. She was no longer the invisible empress. She was no longer Sean Abbott's wife. She was simply Taraji Bartlett, visible and powerful and unapologetic about taking up space that had always belonged to her. The story was not over, because stories about reclaiming yourself never really end. They just transform into new chapters with different challenges. But this chapter was complete. This transformation was finished. This becoming was achieved. She had reclaimed herself from erasure, had built something real on honest foundations, had become visible despite costs that had seemed unbearable, until she paid them and discovered she was stronger than her own fear. And she would never, ever disappear again. Not for love, not for comfort, not for anyone's approval except her own. She was free, and freedom turned out to be exactly what she had been missing while performing someone else's version of happiness. The city lights stretched toward infinity below her windows, and Taraji smiled at her own reflection in the glass, finally recognizing the woman she had always been underneath all the careful hiding.